while responding to a call in Wellington, Florida's Black Diamond neighborhood in May of 2024. Palm Beach County deputies found married couple Tara Marie Jones and Taylor Glenn Jones dead in pools of blood with multiple gunshot wounds. A witness had tried rendering first aid to the victims when the shooter approached and said, "Don't worry, I shot them both," before calmly walking away from the scene. Later identified as the Joneses' neighbor, 63-year-old Norman Scott, the accused killer told police that the couple had attacked him, despite the absence of any weapons lying near their bodies to suggest that this might have been the case. The deadly encounter reportedly stemmed over a disagreement over property boundaries and the placement of a basketball hoop, but surveillance video from Scott's home seemed to contradict his version of events. In the footage, Scott could be seen waving Taylor Jones over to talk, then getting in the victim's face while Taylor remained calm and composed. Scott then pulled a gun and shot Taylor multiple times before turning the weapon toward Tara, who was a few dozen feet away. Tara tried to run but was mercilessly gunned down. As he walked away, the shooter stopped and fired 2 more bullets into Taylor's head, as if to make extra sure that he was no longer alive. Scott remains held without bail on 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder with a firearm. He pleaded not guilty and is awaiting his next court date, which is scheduled for October the 8th of 2024. Number 14. Melina Bogojevska. In a disturbing act of violence that even many hardened criminals could never bring themselves to commit, an 85-year-old Australian widow was beaten to death at her Flemington, Victoria home in July of 2024. 2 days later, a pair of fishermen found the heavily bruised body of 85-year-old Lolene Whitehand in the Maribyrnong River, with plastic bags over her head and tied around her legs. Whitehead lived alone at the residence where she was killed following the death of her husband about a decade earlier. She was well liked in her community, leaving most local residents horrified and sickened by the news of her murder. Investigators traced the crime to the victim's neighbor, 49-year-old Melina Bogojevska, who stands accused of breaking into Whitehead's home and stealing $2,000 worth of jewelry and cash before brutally taking her life. Bogojevska remains detained without bail while the investigation continues and is due back in court in late November. Number 13. Wendell Earl Popejoy. A years-long feud between 2 households in Nunica, Michigan, reached its boiling point the day after Christmas in 2017, when 63-year-old Wendell Popejoy approached 59-year-old Sheila Bong from behind while she was snow-blowing her driveway and shot her in the head with a revolver. The rivalry between Popejoy and Bong dated back to at least 2 years earlier in 2015. During 2016 alone, police responded to at least 13 reported disputes between the warring neighbors. Many of the complaints from both parties seemed trivial and included things like pets trespassing onto one another's property and one of the parties' vehicles blocking a shared easement. In multiple previous incident reports from before the shooting, deputies had described Bong as irrational and explosive, leading to suspicions on more than one occasion that she was the aggressor. Bong also had problems with other neighbors, further pointing toward a pattern of hostility that perhaps made her difficult to get along with. Speaking with the Detroit News after the shooting, 81-year-old Donetta Gould said that Bong had recently approached her while she was walking her dog and said, "I hope you fall and break your hip." This was typical behavior, according to Gould and others, including a local resident who had obtained an order of protection against Bong. On the day that Popejoy pulled the trigger, Bong was purposely blowing snow in people's driveways, and it wasn't her first time doing it. And while being annoyed certainly doesn't legally justify shooting your neighbor, this seems to be what triggered a violent reaction from Popejoy, who had no criminal record prior to the fatal encounter. Some community members rallied around Popejoy following his arrest, but most seem to understand that the law is the law. Authorities charged him with open murder and a jury ultimately convicted him of first-degree murder, which carries an automatic sentence of life without parole in the state of Michigan. Popejoy appealed his case, arguing that he acted in the heat of passion and therefore deserved a lesser conviction of manslaughter, but the court affirmed the previous finding that he had acted with intent and in a premeditated fashion, and the original ruling was upheld. Number 12. Sarah Sands. After learning that 3 of her sons had been targeted by a seemingly trustworthy neighbor in 2014, single mother of 5 Sarah Sands stabbed 77-year-old Michael Pleasted to death in his East London apartment. She initially had no idea that the senior citizen had over 24 prior abuse convictions spanning 3 decades, or that Pleasted had served prison time for his past crimes. The elderly pervert had managed to go unnoticed within the community by changing his name. Sarah's children told her about Pleasted's abuse and the police arrested him, but he denied the allegations and accused the victims of lying. Shortly after learning that Pleasted had been released on bail, Sands entered his flat and plunged a knife into him 8 times. She later claimed that she didn't mean to kill Pleasted and was convicted of manslaughter based on the court's conclusion that she lost control of her emotions. Sands was initially sentenced to 3.5 years in prison, but the sentence was increased to 7.5 years after the judge determined that she had failed to seek help for Pleasted as he lay dying in his apartment. She was released after serving 4 years and has since made it her mission to fight for tighter restrictions on predators who change their identities, which is one way they managed to fly under the radar of a background check. In hindsight, Sands expressed remorse for her actions, but her sons told BBC News that they believe she did the right thing and that Pleasted was never going to stop targeting vulnerable victims as long as he was alive. Number 11. Cynthia Ellen Ming. Shortly before midnight one evening in September of 2022, police were summoned to the Lacey Lakeview, Texas home of 45-year-old Angie Melissa Moore, who told 911 operators that her neighbor was trying to break into her residence. Moore said she had a gun and that she was prepared to defend herself, but the intruder nevertheless managed to wrestle the weapon away from her and shot her in the head. As they arrived at the scene, responding officers saw Moore's neighbor, 50-year-old Cynthia Ellen Ming, running away from the crime scene, naked and covered in blood. An officer tried to subdue her with a taser, but it had no effect. Ming was eventually apprehended by multiple cops and placed in the back of a police cruiser while the investigation began. By the time emergency responders entered Moore's house, she had succumbed to her injuries. While receiving treatment for some cuts she sustained from breaking the victim's window, Ming reportedly told hospital employees that she had murdered her neighbor for killing her dog. A police spokesperson speculated that the allegation about Moore killing Ming's dog was untrue, noting that the victim was a known animal lover. According to the most recent updates on the case, Ming remains in custody at the McLennan County Jail on a capital murder charge, with bail set at $1 million. Number 10. Zach Moyer. What began as a verbal argument between neighbors in Lehighton, Pennsylvania, ended in deadly violence in March of 2024 when one of the parties unwisely introduced a chainsaw into the equation. According to court documents, 30-year-old Zach Moyer became convinced that 59-year-old Edward Whitehead Jr. had harmed innocent victims. After walking away from a disagreement with the older gentleman, Moyer showed up at Whitehead's home donning a scream mask. Armed with a knife and a small chainsaw, he stabbed his neighbor in the head repeatedly, then returned home and waited for the police to arrive. Moyer was arrested on suspicion of criminal homicide. During questioning, he shared his belief that Whitehead had killed women and children the previous year, which the victim's family adamantly denies. He remains held without bail pending the outcome of his case. Unfortunately, however, the problems didn't end there. The day after the murder, Zach's father, Francis Moyer, was arrested for harassing the Whitehead family. Francis was released shortly after being booked into custody, but landed back behind bars about 6 weeks later for taunting a witness with the same type of mask that his son is accused of wearing during the murder. According to police, Francis was seen holding the mask up to a window from outside the victim's home. He remains in custody and is facing a charge for intimidating a witness. Number 9. Evan Marshall. 57-year-old retired schoolteacher Denise Fox vanished from her residence in the Long Island, New York suburb of Glen Cove on a Thursday in 2006. Her daughter dialed 911 after arriving home to find the family's sliding glass door broken and blood on the kitchen floor. A short while later, police found Fox's headless, dismembered body in the basement of a home across the street. Investigators quickly identified the perpetrator as 31-year-old Evan Marshall, a mental patient whose therapist had granted him a weekend pass to visit his family in the gated community. The next morning, Marshall returned to the home in a vehicle with Fox's severed head in the trunk. He admitted to entering the victim's home in search of drug money while extremely high on cocaine and attacking Fox with a knife when they crossed paths. Marshall then dragged Fox's body across the street to his parents' house, where he dismembered her remains and stashed everything but her head in a basement trash can. In 2007, Marshall pleaded guilty to Fox's murder. He was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. In 2015, Fox's surviving family members received a $500,000 settlement in a 7-year-old wrongful death lawsuit against a therapist who granted Marshall a weekend pass shortly before the murder. While handing down the ruling, the judge admonished how the residential facility that was housing Marshall at the time of the murder for failing to take accountability for its role in the tragedy. Number 8. Dennis Moriera. Late one night in May of 2023, police responded to the Bridgewater, Massachusetts home of 69-year-old Dennis Moriera, where they found the man's neighbor, 58-year-old Valerie Oakham, bludgeoned to death with a bloody hammer laying nearby. Oakham had gone over to Moriera's house for a glass of wine earlier that evening, and at some point something had clearly gone terribly wrong. After attacking Oakham, Moriera called his adult son, who called the police. Upon arriving at the scene, officers immediately noticed that Moriera was covered in blood, automatically landing him at the top of the suspect list. Investigators initially offered few details on what they believed led up to the murder, but they revealed that they believed the killing was targeted. Moriera pleaded not guilty to murder and assault and battery with a deadly weapon. He was ordered to undergo a mental evaluation and remains in custody without bail amid the ongoing case. The details of what led up to the horrific crime have yet to be revealed. Number 7. Baltazar Castañeda. 58-year-old Richard Amezquita was relaxing on the front patio of his San Antonio home during the pre-dawn hours one morning in February of 2024 when he was approached by his neighbor, 39-year-old Baltazar Castañeda. A nearby surveillance camera was rolling as Castañeda physically assaulted and ultimately killed Amezquita. In the video, the attacker could be seen dragging the victim's body inside the house and setting it on fire. Castañeda was arrested in connection with the case and is currently facing murder and arson charges, which could put him behind bars for up to 99 years in the event of a conviction. The accused killer is also considered a habitual offender due to 2 prior felony convictions, which could enhance his sentence by decades. Bail was set at $250,000, and he no longer appears to be in custody while he awaits trial. Authorities have yet to reveal a suspected motive for the crime. Number 6. Hector Campos. 48-year-old Hector Campos and his neighbor, 53-year-old Anna Weed, got along well for years before their friendship took a nasty turn in 2016 when Campos tried canceling a family trip to Mexico and his wife decided to go without him. Weed agreed to drive Hector's wife to the airport, unaware that it would spark a grudge that would ultimately claim her life. The seemingly harmless favor sparked a bitter months-long feud between Weed and Campos, whose wife divorced him after the incident. Tensions between the neighbors eventually boiled over, and in early 2017, Campos shot Weed dead outside their homes in the Houston suburb of Spring, Texas. The deadly encounter occurred when Weed took her dog outside while Campos was washing his truck. Campos confronted Weed and accused her of knowing the location of his estranged wife, who had moved out of the home by then. Sensing the tension, Weed's dog began barking, and Campos kicked the canine, then shot Weed as she scrambled to retrieve the pet. Campos claimed that he shot Weed in self-defense after she shoved him and hit him with a roll of packaging tape. But prosecutors suspected that he killed Anna because he blamed her for his marriage falling apart. He was charged with and eventually convicted of Weed's murder and is currently serving a 45-year prison sentence. Number 5. Kenneth Hoyle. 69-year-old Kenny Hoyle and his wife initially got along with Bobby DePaul and August Dempsey, the 40-something couple who lived next door to them in Philadelphia. But a war began when Hoyle reported DePaul for putting a large shed on his property without the proper permit. The city fined DePaul and ordered him to dismantle the shed, but he fought the case. In the meantime, he threw a tantrum at Hoyle and threatened to kill him, only to act perfectly normal the next day as if nothing had happened. It eventually became evident that DePaul's drinking played a role in his increasingly explosive behavior. DePaul won his appeal to keep his shed, which sent Hoyle into an outrage. He began calling the police on the DePauls every chance he got, and the confrontations between the two men grew alarmingly heated. The rivalry took over both couples' lives while endless allegations were hurled back and forth. Hoyle accused DePaul of throwing a cinder block through his car window, dumping a bucket full of maggots on his porch, and poisoning his dog to death. DePaul denied killing Hoyle's dog, but he made it clear that he was doing everything in his power in an attempt to get his neighbor to move. He blared loud music at all hours, flashed blindingly bright lights into the Hoyles' home, and destroyed their fence during a drunken rampage. During one particularly hostile night in 2017, Hoyle called the police, but they were unable to rush immediately to the scene. A short while later, he dialed 911 a second time and confessed to fatally shooting DePaul and Dempsey. He initially claimed that he had acted in self-defense, but surveillance video proved that the victims were unarmed when Hoyle opened fire on them. Hoyle was convicted of 2 counts of murder in 2018 and is currently serving a 66-year prison sentence, which means that he will most likely remain behind bars until his dying day. Number 4. Kevin Wagoner. After moving to Union County, Tennessee with their young grandson in 2010, Mike and Teresa Woodby quickly realized that their neighbor Kevin Wagoner operated a private firing range. The couple initially tolerated the constant sound of gunshots coming from across the street, but Mike politely asked Wagoner if he would tone down the shooting for a few weeks while he recovered after experiencing sudden heart complications. According to the Woodby's version of events, Wagoner assumed that Mike was trying to boss him around, sparking a years-long feud between the households. Wagoner would later tell a much different version of the story, claiming that the rivalry began after he refused to illegally sell Mike a gun. But Wagoner went to suspicious lengths to intimidate the Woodbys, indicating that his anger extended far beyond a simple misunderstanding over a gun sale. He began filming the family constantly, accused Mike of committing disability fraud, and even went to the media with a dramatic tale about the suffering that he claimed the Woodbys were inflicting upon him. Numerous witnesses noticed Wagoner's alarming behavior, including a school bus driver who became worried about the safety of the Woodbys' grandson. Wagoner claimed he was filming the Woodbys to gather evidence of their wrongdoings, but to onlookers, it seemed like he was trying to push Mike off the deep end so he could film his neighbor's explosive reaction for the sake of bolstering his victimhood narrative. The two families called 911 on each other at least 300 times throughout their seemingly endless feud. At one point, the Woodbys begged Wagoner to come to some sort of truce, but he refused to make peace. The long-standing dispute finally ended in 2013 when Wagoner snapped and fatally shot Mike. During the investigation into the crime, the video footage that Wagoner had intrusively recorded for so-called evidence-gathering purposes backfired on him by helping the prosecution prove its case against him. The state also showed the court a disturbing collection of video diaries Wagoner filmed of himself talking about how badly he wanted to kill Mike Woodby, to the point where it bordered on obsession. In 2016, Wagoner was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 18 years in prison. Number 3. Ellen Wink. When 61-year-old Ellen Wink's tenant of 2 years stopped paying for the room he was renting at her Norwalk, Connecticut home in 2021, she told him that she was planning to sell the house and that he would have to move. Whether or not Wink really planned to sell her home is unclear, but she was fed up with her freeloading tenant and wanted him out of there as soon as possible. But 54-year-old Kurt Lemetta had no apparent plan to go anywhere and refused to leave willingly like his landlord had hoped, leading to bitter animosity between him and Wink. In September of 2021, Wink took Lemetta's belongings to a local dump and illegally locked him out of the house. She was arrested and had no choice but to let Lemetta back in tensions reached a breaking point in early 2022 when Wink fatally shot Lametta during a dispute at the residence. She told police that Lametta had attacked her while she was cleaning, but she also mentioned how the victim had been driving her nuts, leading to suspicions that she wasn't as innocent as she claimed. Wink, a former Norwalk City official, was charged with murder. In 2023, she rejected a plea deal which would have come with a 40-year prison sentence. She continues to stand by her self-defense claim and plans to take the case to trial, despite the risk of a 60-year prison sentence if convicted as charged. A trial date has yet to be set. Today's topic was requested by RyanX7170 and Cy Jerry. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Enrique Faselli. 55-year-old Julian Aubrey was a well-known gay rights activist and a respected member of his London neighborhood, which was why the community was shocked when he was found stabbed to death in his London flat in 2017. Investigators initially speculated that the murder had possibly been motivated by homophobia or somehow connected to Aubrey's past struggles with addiction. Their findings instead led them to Aubrey's neighbor of 20 years, 48-year-old Enrique Faselli, a former Uruguayan diplomat who had filed multiple complaints against Aubrey in recent years. Faselli accused Aubrey of leaving feces in the hallway of their apartment building so residents would blame Faselli's dog. He was also convinced that Aubrey was trying to poison him to death, although detectives found no evidence to back up either of these claims. Further investigation revealed that Faselli's complaints against Aubrey began shortly after he lost his job at the Uruguayan embassy 2 years prior to the murder in 2015. Faselli had worked as a diplomat for many years when his mental health suddenly declined to the point where he was no longer capable of doing his job. He spent a month in a psychiatric hospital shortly before the murder, and his condition continued to worsen following his release. Even after paying a private investigator to inspect his apartment for listening devices or evidence that Aubrey was poisoning him through the air ducts and coming up empty-handed, Faselli continued to believe that his neighbor had it out for him. He eventually became convinced that the only way he could protect himself was by killing Aubrey, bringing the bizarre situation to a tragic end. Faselli pleaded guilty to manslaughter with diminished responsibility and was remanded to a psychiatric hospital where he'll remain until or unless he is deemed to no longer be a threat to himself or others. If you thought these neighbors from hell weren't frightening enough, wait till you see how clients exacted payback on their lawyers in the most twisted ways possible. Right after number 1, we've got our previous release of 7 clients who went after their lawyers lined up. Stay tuned. Number 1. Pete Richter. After retiring during the 1990s, former Baltimore police officer Charles Edward Pete Richter and his wife Barbara began construction on a new home in Stevensville, Maryland. While visiting the unfurnished residence one day, the couple were approached by neighbors, Mark and Diane Zander, who introduced themselves and welcomed the Richters to the neighborhood. But someone vandalized the house before the Richters even moved in, causing $20,000 worth of damage. And when Pete Richter heard that Mark Zander and another neighbor had been peering in through the windows, he became convinced that Zander was responsible for the crime. No arrests were made due to a lack of evidence, and the Zanders hoped to move past the misunderstanding and re-establish amicable ties with the Richters. Unfortunately, Pete refused to let go of his suspicions against the Zanders. He soon made enemies with several other neighbors due to his frequent complaints over slight disturbances like music, ATVs, and the sounds of children playing. The situation only worsened when the Zanders' home mysteriously burned down in 2001, leading to suspicions that Pete was responsible for the fire. By that point, several other neighbors had moved away specifically to get away from Pete, but the Zanders loved their community and refused to leave. They rebuilt the house, and the tensions between them and the Richters continued for upwards of a decade. In April of 2011, Pete lured the Zanders' dog into his yard and accused Mark of trespassing when he came to retrieve the pet. Mark tried to avoid a confrontation and was attempting to leave the property when Pete shot him twice in the back, killing him at the scene. Pete argued that he had acted in self-defense but failed to convince a jury of his innocence and was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison and is now 80 years old, which means that he may end up spending the rest of his life behind bars. On February the 19th of 2019, David Chiselton was standing before a judge in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, to be sentenced after he'd pleaded guilty to a number of charges. 2 years prior, Chiselton had been responsible for a police standoff lasting several hours after an incident in which he'd struck his girlfriend with a pistol and set his apartment complex on fire. By 2019, he'd admitted, among others, domestic abuse, aggravated arson, and felonious assault. During the hearing, he found out that he was being sentenced to 47 years in prison. Chiselton then punched his defense lawyer, Aaron Brockler, who was standing next to him. The attack was captured by the body cams of deputies present in the courthouse and witnessed by a room full of legal representatives. Medical records indicated that Brockler had suffered 2 hairline fractures of his nose and a sprained MCL. In spite of insurmountable evidence, the ensuing felonious assault charge against Chiselton was dismissed in October of that same year. His new lawyer, Jim Jenkins, successfully argued that the injuries hadn't inflicted the level of physical harm necessary to meet the charge. Jenkins told the court, "David Chiselton doesn't pack much of a punch," before turning to his client and saying, "I love you, but you don't pack much of a punch." Chiselton took the stand and alleged that Brockler had banked on his friendship with the judge's husband to ensure that he'd be getting a sentence close to the minimum of 9 years. He admitted to punching him out of rage upon finding out he was getting 47. Chiselton applauded the jury, who found him not guilty, before heading back to jail. In 2021, Brockler filed a lawsuit against him, as well as the 2 deputies who'd handcuffed him for restraining his hands at the front instead of behind his back, as it was the department's policy. Number 6. Nando Perez. A custodian working at the Queen's office of New York City lawyer Charles Zolot found him dead on the floor on the morning of August the 5th of 2022. Zolot had been stabbed multiple times and had suffered trauma to his back. The 65-year-old handled bankruptcy, real estate, and all areas of family law. Another lawyer working in the same building told CBS New York that his legal assistants had reported overhearing a heated argument at around closing time on August the 4th. Zolot's lifeless body was found by cleaning staff the following day. An investigation was launched by law enforcement, and his killer was identified as 54-year-old Bronx man Nando Perez. He was confirmed by the NYPD to have been a disgruntled client of Zolot's. The authorities provided no further details, but there was suspicion that Perez was angry over how the lawyer had handled the foreclosure of his home. 5 days after Zolot's body was found, Perez was arraigned on charges of second-degree murder and criminal possession of a weapon in the 4th degree. The man's brother was believed to have been in the room as well, but the extent of his involvement in the killing, if any, remained unspecified. Number 5. Lamont Payne. Lamont Payne, a man with a long history of assault and disruptive behavior, was in court in 2018 for attacking a corrections officer at the 4th Avenue Jail in Maricopa County, Arizona. The incident, which had occurred in 2016, involved him blocking out the windows of his cell and placing soapy water on the floor to make it difficult for guards to remove him. He then got on the ground as they entered and bit into a guard's ankle, causing a laceration. While in court for the attack, Payne was assigned public defender Vladimir Gagic. During the first day of jury selection, Payne attempted to fire him and repeatedly disrupted the proceedings. He was seen trying to get his lawyer's attention by banging on his desk, but Gagic seemingly ignored him. Payne disregarded the judge's warnings and was eventually ordered to be removed from court. In a video-recorded incident, he got up and started collecting some papers, then forcefully sucker-punched Gagic in the face and cursed at him. Payne was restrained by a deputy as Gagic rose to his feet, shaken up by the strike. He was left with a bloody nose and mouth, subsequently telling the media, "I could literally taste his knuckles." He filed assault charges against Payne. While stunned by the attack, Gagic later reported that he was more upset with the manner in which the Public Defense Services had treated him in the aftermath. They suspended his contract and asked him to repay the $1,000 he'd been given to defend Payne, citing multiple complaints about his lack of communication with clients. Another attorney and PDS. Number 4. Peter Hafer. In June of 2007, Peter Hafer and an accomplice burglarized a Kmart in Kentucky, making off with over $50,000 in jewelry. He was arrested in August and in February of the following year appeared in Scott County Circuit Court. 30-year-old Hafer's court-appointed lawyer was a man by the name of Doug Crickmer. During the hearing, Hafer told the court that he was dissatisfied with Crickmer's services and asked for a new lawyer, but was denied, with a judge telling him that he couldn't choose his public defender. Looking back on what followed, Hafer would claim, "I just couldn't take it anymore and I just snapped." As Crickmer began explaining his side of the argument, Hafer threw a haymaker to his chin that dropped him to the floor. The inmate was able to land a few more blows to Crickmer's head and stomach as deputies struggled to contain him. The lawyer was taken to a local hospital, but released later that same day. In a subsequent interview for a media outlet, Crickmer bore the marks of his client's attack, which included 2 black eyes. He, however, stated that he understood Hafer's frustration and didn't blame him, adding that he wasn't planning to pursue assault charges. The incident ultimately worked in Hafer's favor as he was appointed a new lawyer. Number 3. LaMarcus Williamson. After pleading guilty to robbery, drug and assault charges, LaMarcus Williamson was about to be sentenced in early October of 2012 at court in York County, South Carolina. He had a lengthy prison record dating back to 2000 and had been arrested most recently in March for choking a female Winthrop University student. At the time, the police also found 9 grams of crack cocaine on him. Attorney Dan Hall was sitting next to Williamson as his punishment was read out. It was the legal representative's 58th birthday and only the second time he'd worked with Williamson, as he was reportedly standing in for a colleague. 30-year-old Williamson reacted in disbelief when his sentence of 15 years was read out. 2 deputies moved closer to him as the inmate became increasingly agitated. Surveillance video from the crowded courtroom showed Hall touching Williamson's shoulder and pointing to the door, seemingly suggesting they leave. Within moments, Williamson violently lashed out, and even though he was in handcuffs, punched the lawyer in the face. He tried to land further blows after Hall had collapsed, but deputies promptly intervened and hauled him out of the courtroom. He later offered a bizarre explanation for the punch, describing it as an angry reaction to his solicitor trying to incriminate him, like he was some bad guy. 6 months were added to his sentence, the harshest possible punishment for contempt of court. Hall was left with a bleeding lip and a sore jaw, but subsequently claimed that it could have been worse. He noted that if the blow had landed an inch higher, his nose would have been broken, and an inch lower, he would have lost his front teeth. Hall also joked that it wasn't the best birthday present he'd ever received. Number 2. Christchurch District Court Incident. In late November of 2019, New Zealand lawyer Tony Gregg was representing a high-security prisoner who was not named at the Christchurch District Court. The offender had been charged with assaulting a prison officer. As the hearing progressed, the judge asked him to go back to the docks for sentencing. The man got up and suddenly delivered a powerful blow to Gregg's head that blindsided him and sent him flying from his chair and onto the floor. The offender was restrained by 3 corrections officers and subsequently returned to prison. It wasn't made immediately clear if he faced new charges or if time was added to his sentence. Gregg was taken to a nurse at the Justice Precinct, who stitched up a cut on his brow. Gregg described the attack as sudden but unavoidable, noting that if a client was dissatisfied with their attorney and wanted to hurt them, they had plenty of opportunities to do so. Gregg returned to work unshaken by the attack and in spite of the fact that it had left him with stitches and bruising to his face. Number 1. Joshua Monson. In May of 2011, Washington man Joshua Monson was in Snohomish County Court for second-degree murder and felony drug possession. During a hearing for the latter charge, 27-year-old Monson grabbed a pencil and stabbed his lawyer, Thomas Cox, in the neck. Cox wasn't seriously hurt and opted to stay on as Monson's attorney, but was replaced by Gurjit Pandya. A few days after the hearing, Monson appeared in court again, via video conference from jail. During the proceedings, he stabbed Paneer with a small jailhouse pencil. Again, the lawyer avoided major injury and was replaced. Monson's mental health came into question, but he was found competent to stand trial. In late October, Monson was in court once more with his new legal representative, Jesse Cantor. He didn't have any access to sharp objects and was fitted with a stun cuff on his leg that could be activated by corrections officers and shock him in case of another outburst. The prosecution had argued that Monson should have had his legs restrained with leather shackles. Cantor, however, opposed them, arguing that they'd influenced the way in which the jurors regarded Monson and jeopardized his right to a fair trial. The judge agreed. Then, during the hearing, Monson moved to grab Cantor's pen. A corrections officer activated the stun cuff, but it failed to stop him. Monson stabbed his lawyer in the side of the head with the pen before he was subdued by officers. Much like those before him, Cantor emerged without significant injuries. The judge ruled that through his repeated attacks, for which he was charged with 2 counts of fourth-degree assault, Monson had forfeited his right to legal counsel and would thus represent himself. He was also ordered to be restrained for the remainder of the trial. During a subsequent hearing, Monson urged the jury to keep an open mind, claimed that he was framed and that the police had misidentified the substance in his possession as methamphetamine when it was actually rock salt. After the jury left the courtroom to deliberate, a restrained Monson smiled at the prosecution and said, "Congratulations." He was found guilty of drug possession and a few months later found guilty of murder. The second charge stemmed from an incident on January the 2nd of 2011. It was then that Monson was accused of shooting 30-year-old Brian Jones in the back of the head while he was talking on the cell phone at his Everett apartment. Monson was sentenced to 45 years in prison. Thanks for watching. Would you rather live next door to a family of rednecks or a family of arrogant and posh people? Let us know in the comments section below.